Chapter 11 Juvenile Gangs and Delinquency. In this chapter, we'll be going away from generators such as families, schools, and youth subculture. We'll be focusing more on acts of delinquents in the United States, which can vary from individual acts all the way up until gang acts. The solitary delinquent. This is a form of deviant behavior in which a certain individual acts alone. Sometimes opportunities just present themselves to these individuals, and they do it alone without an accomplice or a witness. Sometimes they just prefer to act alone. And some of them do it out of frustration and anger. Loner rule. The solitary delinquent may be a social isolate who is unable to make friends or who prefers to work or play alone. Throughout society, there are people who do not make close affiliations with groups if such person is motivated toward delinquency. It is normal to act as an individual and not as a member of a clique or gang. 1/3 of juveniles who have come in front of a court have committed their delinquent acts alone. But yes, there has been little research done on the delinquent acts in form of solitary. Sociologists have the idea that the behavior of an individual always revolves around the social network. Let us look into shoplifters. Every year, there are about $13 billion stolen in goods from retail merchants. Of the $13 billion, 25% of those account for juvenile stealing. Of those juveniles, 89% say they know other juveniles who shoplift as well, but only 69% say they hang out with others who steal. There are also professional shoplifting gangs, but most shoplifters operate alone. There are many people who do not see the connection between a solitary delinquent, shoplifter, and other members of a society. Those people may not be responsible for the action itself, but are related in some type of way. If we would look closer into the connection and create some type of social web, we would be able to see the connections and how it is either voluntary or involuntary, primarily or secondarily, formally or informally influenced. Nonetheless, these deviants or delinquents' acts can be very negative and traumatic toward other people who share the same social network. Delinquency is mainly not performed in isolation, but takes place by way of a group, context, or a couple of juveniles acting incoherent.
Hi, my name is Ani, and I'm going to be talking about a few subjects. My first one is dyads and triads. A dyad is a social group composed of just two persons. A triad is a group of three persons in a social interaction. These sociological descriptors for very small groups are the focal point of findings that have weakened common stereotypes of large groups or gangs of youth participating together in collective delinquency. Paul Lerman did a study in 1967. He used self-report techniques with 700 boys aged 10 to 19 living in New York City. He determined that until the age of 14 or 15, most boys committed delinquent acts together with one or two close friends. Boys ages 16 to 19, more of the youth could be classified as loners, but paired and triad participants in illegal conduct continue to be the most dominant groupings. Most delinquent acts usually involve just two or three close friends operating together in less than sensational manner. They may be members of large gang groups whose values, norms, and behavioral expectations are far more altruistic, but more delinquency is acted out in much smaller social units than the gang. A major, some studies where a major factor influencing a youth's subsequent delinquent behavior is primary association with delinquent friends in small groups or large gangs. Delinquent friends are more likely to reinforce crime, model crime, and teach beliefs favorable to crime. The next subject I'm going to be talking about is group delinquency. In addition to sociological principles regarding the social cause and consequences of human behavior, there is considerable documentation that most juvenile delinquency is committed by social groupings that vary by size, purpose, and organizations. There are three studies who studied group delinquency. Erickson and Gary Jensen administered self-report questionnaires to 1,700 high school students from three small towns and three urban schools, each of 18 delinquent acts and how many of those times they had been in company of others. Findings: youth generally engage in delinquent behavior when they are with their friends. Females are more likely than males to commit delinquent acts in groups. Brunner, in 1974, said groups processes played a central role in juvenile crime in Germany, and that between 80 and 90% of illegal behavior by juveniles involved in groups of youths, particularly gang and drug abuse.
In the section Playgroups in urban areas, it specifically says that in an apartment complex, there are many limitations to where children and adolescents can go out and play together, other than the streets and the sidewalks. These children tend to play hide and seek and pick up basketball. And with these children constantly being together, and since they live in the same area, they come as close as almost family. And within time, they play these games, and as they get older, they become less satisfying and entertaining. Usually, these playgroups begin to experiment a more aggressive approach of play and experiment with youths outside of their groups. Time magazine reported that a child stated mugging is like playing a game and kids do it for the fun of it. Delinquent behavior starts a career of delinquent careers, such as shoplifting, and in juvenile gangs, juveniles and delinquent behavior commit crimes because of they consider it a social activity. Juveniles who come together, they see it as an excitement and a need to satisfy themselves as juveniles, while victims see this as a violent behavior and a frightening crime. Playgroups start as early as an association with gang members, which leads to a pattern of illegal conduct, and the society views them as a threat.
A basic definition of a gang is a group of persons assembled and acting or working together. And although a gang does not have to be composed of criminals and does not have to be associated with criminal acts, in today's society, that is usually what happens. People do usually associate a gang with criminal conduct and criminals consisting of the gang. Um, and a man named Walter Miller defined a gang as a group of recurrently associating individuals with identifiable leadership and internal organization, identifying with or claiming control over territory in a community and engaging either individually or collectively in violent or other forms of illegal behavior. So, again, associating with the criminal behavior in the definition of a gang. And depending on the gang, there are different objectives, different orientations, and different organizations that make up all the different gangs, and that is discussed later in the book. And a man named James Short came up with criteria for definitions of gangs, and these criteria consisted of recurrent congressional recurrent congregation outside of the home, self-defined inclusion or exclusion, and continuity of affiliation. Territorial basis consisting of customary hanging and ranging areas, including self-defined use and occupancy rights. Versatile activity repertoire and organizational differentiation. And when asking an actual member of a gang what the definition of a gang is, this individual said, "You look out for me and I look out for you. That's what makes a gang." So there are a lot of differences in definitions for gangs, and different people with different professions and different life experiences, whether having been in a gang, whether being a sociologist, things like that, really just depends. And so different people do have a lot of different outlooks on gangs and would provide a different definition. And there were actually gangs in England as early as the 20th century, and this is when the term hooligan came to be. It came from the hooligan gang, which was present in London in the 1980s. And it was also noted that in Russia, many of the impoverished young people would turn to these gangs in order for survival. They would join these gangs and they would be able to have people look out for them, have a way to get the things that they need to live. And so a lot of these young people viewed this as their only option in order to survive, as compared with all the alternatives. And lastly, during the 19th century, a lot of the gangs that were in America were actually of the Irish descent, and this was thought to be because these young people came here with little money, little education, a very low social status. They ended up living in the slums of many cities, is what the book called it, and they felt like they had nowhere to turn. And just like the young people in Russia, they made a decision to turn to this life of crime in order to escape the turmoil that they felt their life was in, and because they felt like they didn't have any other options. So part of this chapter is about, first of all, defining a gang and realizing the differences in definitions of gangs, and also realizing the reasons that many young people originally joined gangs. And it wasn't always just to live a life of crime. A lot of the time it was just in order to survive.
Hi, my name is Brittany Tino, and I will be discussing the section about media portrayal of gangs. Gangs are often depicted as male-only structures composed primarily of minorities who spent their entire lives stuck in the cycle of violence, despite the research that proved this to be very inaccurate. Between 1960 and 1980, several movies were released depicting gang members as unlawful, threatening, and dangerous. However, they did recognize that the individuals were merely misunderstood youths protecting their territory. A few examples of movies released during that time were Blackboard Jungle, Lords of Flatbush, Rumblefish, and Outsiders. Between 1980 and 1990, a couple movies came out which showed that young boys in bad neighborhoods do not have many other options but to join gangs, since they are constantly surrounded by alcohol, drugs, crime, and violence. A connection has been made between gang behavior and movies. Many gang members feel the need to live up to the dangerous and violent stereotypical gang member that is portrayed in movies. Real-life gangs may in fact be reflecting the behavior exhibited in gang movies rather than gang movies reflecting real-life gangs. Television news focuses on violent juvenile acts and youth involvement in gangs. This has resulted in the alteration of society's perception of youth violence. Research shows that the majority of juvenile delinquency is not even gang-related, despite what the media has to say. The next section is contemporary youth gangs in the United States. In Chicago, 1927, Frederick Thrasher conducted the first scholarly investigation of youth gangs in the United States. Many gangs initially gathered to participate in socially acceptable activities such as dancing and other athletic activities. However, members were involved in delinquent activities both individually and as a group.
Number of gangs and members. The criteria for classifying a group as a gang would include having 3 or more members around the ages of 12 to 24, all members having a shared identity, whether it's a name, color, or other various signs. Members identified themselves as a gang or are recognized as a gang from the outside sources. Some type of organization within the group, and members within the group are involved in many criminal acts. The Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention of the United States Department of Justice created the National Youth Gang Center, also known as NYGC, in 1995. The NYGC conducted national surveys as a method to find data about youth gangs in America. Some groups were excluded from the data, such as motorcycle gangs, hate or ideology groups, prison gangs, and exclusive adult gangs. The data projected a high rate of American youth that were involved in gangs and gang-related crimes. In 1997, the National Youth Gang Survey came from 2,766 urban and suburban police and county sheriff's departments, and the data concluded that 4,712 cities and counties experienced gangs in 1997, while in 1998 the amount increased going up to 4,824. In 2003, the Bureau of Justice Assistance funded the National Gang Center, also known as NGC. This program was created to examine the intensity of gang involvement in the United States. In 2009, the two programs, NYGC and NGC, combined to find more efficient data on gang members and gang activities. The gang activities and gang-related crimes hold a huge impact on the crime issues in the United States. In the next section, locale, Robert Park states that gangs are not confined to cities because they can be found anywhere and everywhere. A stereotype of youth gang members is the inner city phenomenon, meaning that the inner city is the natural habitat for these gang members. Slum neighborhoods are focal points for these members, including juvenile delinquency behaviors. Shaw and McKay, along with others, believe that delinquency is manifest and encouraged by these poor areas. The NYGC conducted a survey for reports of gang member problems, and 90% of larger cities reported these gang problems, 51% of suburban areas reported, 33% of smaller cities, and less than 15% of rural areas reported of gang problems. Urban gang members defend their territories where they intend to dominate and take over. The territories can be anywhere in the neighborhood, such as a park, a pool area, a school, or a recreational center. Gang members will identify and defend their territories to make sure other gang members from other areas or any other outsiders stay away.
Motives for gang memberships come in various reasons. One of the reasons is because of boredom. The other is defiance of authorities, loyalty to one's own racial or ethnic group, adventure, money for drug trade, and simply poor relationships with their parents and teachers. Plenty of gang members have stated that they have joined a gang because of fear of being alone and to be seen as vulnerable in a tough neighborhood. Plenty of people joined gangs when they were young. It was their desire being a part of something. Young people see former friends or associates join their local gangs, and it makes them want to join or simply try it. When it comes down to James Coleman's concepts of social capital, it's pretty much a resilience in some individuals that enables them to resist the allure of potentially damaging associates and activities. Plenty of young men have mentioned that gang memberships was the only available avenue for them to achieve respect and identity. For initiation rituals, there's various forms of rituals for gang members to join. Many gangs are informally organized and have only vague objectives. A few gangs only require you to have good interaction or simply hang out with them. More aggressive gangs require violent initiation ceremonies. An old study done by Herbert Bloch and Arthur Niederhofer cited a wide assortment of rituals and symbols, including jackets decorated with gang names and logos, scarification and tattooing sessions, resulting in permanent display of gang affiliation, as well as um, as well as other various things. If the person trying to join chickens out, he is rejected for gang membership, or also since he might know a lot, he or she might even be killed. Unfortunately, contemporary gangs jump in new members where the initiate must stand up to a severe beating by other gang members. Um, According to NBC Dateline, it is reported that the initiation for girls in Texas involves them having sex with somebody infected with HIV. Another female initiation is called roll the dice, in which the digits on the dice they determine the number of males with whom the new member must have sex with. And that's for initiation rituals.
The next one I'm going to be talking about is gang organizations. Frederick Thrasher observed that no two gangs are just alike. They indicated that wide divergence in the character of its personnel combined with differences of physical, social, environmental, or experience and traditional give every gang its own particular character. It varies by membership, types of leaders, activities, and status. The smaller and less goal-oriented youth gangs have one or two older, tougher, more articulate boys with forceful personalities, maybe informally acknowledged leaders. Larger and more instrumental gangs may have a function organization, are well known to be fighting gangs. Formal and informal alliances may be worked out between gangs that find some particular advantage or benefit in such alliances. Gang clusters consist of 3 or 4 age-graded male subgroups plus a female auxiliary. Each group maintains its own identity and generic name, and youth gangs in a way look up to these adult gangs and try to work agreements out. Meetings take place loosely defined by smaller gangs and their members, as in any time, all the time, anywhere or everywhere, and certainly located street corners and shopping mall or a convenience store may serve as a gang headquarters. Large gangs also have taken over different cities. And that's it for me. Thank you.
The Near Group. Louis Jablonski complained that most efforts to explain gang organizations begin with the imprecise assumptions that gangs fit the pattern of traditionally defined social groups. The delinquent gang is organizationally midway between the stability of a highly organized, cohesive, established group and the instability of a disorganized, anonymous, and destructive mob. The gang is a kind of social collectivity in its own right, with characteristics especially suited to meet the very needs of its members. Jablonski maintained the most delinquent gangs are midway on the group mob continuum and thus are structurally neither groups nor mobs. The near group is characterized by diffuse role definitions, limited cohesion, impermanence, minimal consensus of norms, shifting members, disturbed leadership, and limited definition of membership expectations. The challenges other researchers have made for Jablonski, which is Cohen and Short in 1958, other proponents of the gang subculture concept argue that many gang members share a remarkable consensus regarding norms and roles. Klein in 1971 contended that the large majority of gang leaders are not sociopathic, nor do they otherwise suffer serious emotional maladjustments. John Hagedorn in 1998 said that on the basis of his study of Milwaukee gangs confirmed Thrasher's observation on the diversity of a gang organization and cautioned against the pyramid stereotype of a hardcore of sociopathic criminals leading a broad fringe of impressionable kids. The Milwaukee gangs come in many forms and shapes, but none that look like a pyramid. Each age group has its own main group, its leaders, and its wannabes.
Gang graffiti, argot, slanguage, and symbols. Slanguage is a unique argot and ever-evolving jargon or language. Slanguage is a way in which members of the gang are able to communicate in a less obvious way when it comes to crimes committed by the gang. Graffiti. Slanguage is reflected in youth gang graffiti. The newspapers of the streets is what it's known as. Graffiti is one of the first signs of a street gang activity in a neighborhood. Several purposes for graffiti are identifying territorial boundaries, giving a roster of members, advertising gang exploits, and communicating messages to rival gangs. Graffiti is useful to law enforcement as well, identifying gangs that are operating in certain areas, identifying members through monikers or nicknames, aiding in monitoring gang challenges and rivalries, and assists in developing leads on suspects of gang related crimes. Composition of gang membership. Usually, a group or population with the same demographic traits are what typify a group. Three population characteristics of gang members are what contribute to the formation of the delinquent behavior of youthful gangs. 1. Social class. 2. Racial and ethnic composition. And 3. Female participation.
So the first characteristic of gang membership is social class. Official crime reports have found that juvenile delinquency is concentrated in lower socioeconomic neighborhoods. There is a strong relationship between lower class unemployment and poverty with high incidence of property crime. Some characteristics of gang members include coming from poor neighborhoods with substandard housing and having little hope for educational or occupational achievement. The book uses the phrase code of the streets, which translates to of hopelessness and poverty into violence. Howard and Barbara Myeroff observed middle-class gangs, and they found that they lacked alienated leadership and violent behavior that is often seen in lower-class gangs, did not demonstrate well-developed delinquent values, did not define themselves as delinquents or troublemakers, and eventually they expected themselves to abandon their deviant behaviors and become law-abiding citizens. The second characteristic is the straight edgers, and this was created by an ultra-conservative youth group called the Straight Edgers, which ran from 1995 to 1998. And these youths were the ones that reacted violently against other youth offenses like drug and alcohol use and the practice of casual sex. They actually take their name from a song called Straight Edge by Ian MacKaye. And the extreme hardcore straight edgers often use chains, mace, knives, clubs, beatings, brawls, and others to enforce their abstinent lifestyles to their peers. They also use the symbol X, which is also what clubs use to indicate anyone that is under 21. Arlene Levinston actually did a study of these straight edgers and found that the typical straight edger was white, male, middle class, and anywhere between early teens to early 20s. She found that the extreme ones were often strict vegetarians and were involved in violent crimes as part of the Animal Liberation Front. The final characteristic is racial and ethnic composition of gangs. And race and ethnicity are powerful forces that draw people into cohesive groups, especially if they feel like they have suffered some sort of injustice, which this leads to a strengthening of the bond. Davis found that race and ethnicity is unifying and sacred cause for gangs. Howard Erlanger's study focused on Hispanic Americans in East Los Angeles. He found that there is a deep resentment between Hispanic Americans and the educational system in East Los Angeles because the children were often punished for speaking Spanish in school, and in turn the children interpreted this as a rejection by the Anglo society. James Vigil also did a study, and he found that starting from the 1940s, youth groups had periodic outbursts of destructive behavior, but by the 1990s they had become violent and deadly. He concluded that about 4 to 10% of Mexican American youths belong to gangs, but the National Gang Center puts this number closer to 12%. Most gang members are African American or Hispanics, but there is a new emergence of Vietnamese gangs, and these gangs are often concentrated and emerged from Vietnamese communities in California. They use violence, robbery, bombs, extortions, and murders as terror tactics, and they usually disband after a 3 to 4 day rampage and eventually fade into the general population. A majority of these gangs are homogeneous in race and ethnicity, but some have variants, especially in neighborhoods where housing is well integrated, and which Corbin and Peluso found that the dominant race held higher positions of power within the group.
Okay. Female participation in delinquent gangs. Female association in group misconduct has been more aloof than dynamic, with young girls and young women working as bolster staff to a male individual as opposed to as equivalent members. James Short and various different suitably portray these females and their optional parts and statuses as a branch association of a female assistant. A female auxiliary is a normal thing, and they exist to perform many capacities for young men's gang members and appreciate a level of self-governance among themselves. Auxiliary status used to be the most well-known type of group corporation accessible to females. A few gangs allow sexually incorporated enrollment. The middle class rural gangs whose young individuals have not been truly distanced from white-collar class standards and values and still try to working class instructive and work-related goals. The woman gang members population. Ann Campbell assessed the roughly 10 for each penny of the developing group populace in New York City are females going in age from 14 to 30. National Youth Gang Survey in 2006 that females represented roughly 11% of dynamic group individuals in the United States. In spite of that fact that numbers were most elevated in urban zones, the extent of female grouped individuals was most elevated in provincial regions. CBS News report estimated that roughly 1,000 young ladies are included in more than 100 female gangs in Chicago alone. It was underscored that there are not sister associations to the male gangs, yet autonomous female gangs. The similarities to male gangs and their belongings to the group. Like their male partners, these females stake out their own turf of region, receive unmistakable cues and symbols, and have physical encounters and battles with opponent gangs. Confirm proposes that expended brutality among female groups may worsen the issue for male gangs individuals to affirm their manliness. Female gangs today, like male gangs, also vary considerably in motivation and kind of criminal involvement. For example, heavy drugs, prostitution, illegal movements. The slide vixens are into substantial medications and prostitution, while the 14 to 19-year-old tiny diablas take a week after week accumulation to purchase weapons and fight that their group gives them a social structure and feeling of personality that they would not have anywhere else. Why young females affiliate with gangs. Ann Campbell's subjective investigation of the girls in the gang 1991 found that enrollment in 3 New York City gangs spoke to dissolate and distant young ladies from transient and physically savage families. Other researchers suggest that they are socially maladjusted, come from broken and unhappy homes, and do not relate well to the opposite sex. Most studies show friendship, solidarity, self-affirmation, and a sense of new possibilities motive young inner-city females to join and remain in gangs. Gang violence. Law implementation offices, criminologists, and other people who have practically experience in the investigation of adolescent wrongdoings for the most part concur that gang participation improves the probability of more genuine reprobate conduct. Many gangs do not have crime as their dominant activity. Offenses are committed spontaneously, and most members have temporary gang memberships and short criminal careers. While only some gang members were involved in gang violence, it was mostly done to show masculinity and gain respect, and was done with no weapons but physical body. More research was done by Miller proving that young gang members' murder rate was going up throughout the years due to weapons. Gang violence continued to undergo modifications in strategy and style over the years. Back in the days, gangs used to fight with bottles, clubs, chains, knives, and fists. Now they fight with handguns, revolvers, and shotguns. Gangbangs is a generic term for a variety of other gang violence, including assaults, rapes, knifings, killings, and beatings. Drive-by homicides began to decline in LA in 1993. However, when that started happening, the police started to go around the poor and gang neighborhoods even more. So the Mexican Mafia issued an anti-drive-by edict in the belief that the practices threatened its lucrative drug trade by bringing unwanted attention to the neighborhoods. So many gangs further adapted with the walk-up or the walk-by, shooting in which the gunman attacks his targeted victim face-to-face. This was also the easiest transition, as most gangs thought it was more honorable and respectful. If you're going to be a man and shoot somebody, at least have the guts to look them in the face and shoot them. It is more honorable to kill at a close range. The Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention detailed the gangs assumed a part in the right around 80% of the pre-adult manslaughter occurrences examined in LA. Gang-related homicides are concentrated mostly in large cities and seem to have increased slightly from 2000 to 2010. Violence touches and terminates the lives of a very large portion of American young people over and above the conspicuous and aggressive street gangs. Auto accidents are primarily the number one killer, but homicide deaths among young people have skyrocketed 300% in 3 decades. It now is the number two killer between Americans 15 to 24 years of age. Through the years to come, more young kids are going to be the subject of poverty, which will lead to dropouts, pregnancies, gangs, drugs, etc. The Federal Bureau of Investigation have given top priority to rapidly expanding criminal enterprise that has been labeled America's most vicious gangs.
Franchises and gang warfare. The main difference between gangs of the past and gangs of today are the use of firearms and the involvement with drugs. The rapid increase of the gangs are due to violence and drugs. Now, cities and rural areas are being designed in a way to ease people being able to sell cocaine and other illegal drugs. Now, gangs are the ones who push the drugs and they overall enforce and control what is sold, how it is sold, the price of the drugs, and etc. According to a 2006 National Youth Gang Survey, law enforcement officers say that 43% of drug sales involve gang members. Now, street gangs bring the drugs into the country and then they become the primary distributors since they're the ones that ultimately brought it into the country. Now, for the next section, gang rape. Gang rape is another form of violent crime that involves surprisingly large numbers of American youth. Um, a study done by Menachem Amir showed that 43% of rape cases were multiple rape, since multiple rape is almost as common as single rape. The most significant fact about multiple rape was that the perpetrators were commonly from age 10 to 19, so all very young. In 1989, there was a case where there were 6 New York City youths who were sent to trial for brutalizing and raping a young woman who was out jogging. They left her for dead. She had a crashed school. Now, this brought them the term wilding. That's how they described it in court, which ultimately the trial was declared a mistrial and the youths were released. Another astonishing case in which happened in Cleveland were one where this 11-year-old girl was raped by at least 18 boys. Some psychiatrists argue that gang rape is an expression of homosexuality, so stating that co-rapists ultimately want to rape each other or like be with the person they're raping. Participating in gang rape fulfills a social need rather than a sexual desire, especially for the youth who want to prove that they're not chickens. So they rape so that their friends won't like consider them chicken. One of the many problems with these acts is that people stand around and don't help. In 1983, a woman walked into a bar and several men attacked her, and no one did a thing until she ran into the street naked and a motorcyclist helped her and called the police. So bystanders are a big problem.
Explanatory theories. Deviant subculture. Any subgroup that deviates markedly from the generally accepted values, norms, and behavioral expectations of the dominant society. These are not ordinarily perceived as a threat to society. However, we have criminal or delinquent subcultures, which manifest such extreme and negative nonconformity to the normative prescriptions of the larger society that its members are generally viewed as antisocial or just against society. Juvenile delinquents often gain identification and encouragement from other delinquents and from criminal elements in their area with whom they associate. Environments in which delinquents are raised teach them that this deviant behavior is socially acceptable and in turn is rewarded. This subculture clashes with society because it is in conflict with the dominant laws of the land. Theory of reactive subculture. It is a group of theoretical constructs that share the idea that misconduct is elicited in lower class youths who have internalized class cultural and objective of educational, occupational, and materialistic success, and are frustrated in their achievement. Albert Cohen says delinquent subculture is an economic response towards the resolution of a state's problems of lower class boys. Richard Cloward and Lloyd Owen agreed with Cohen, but also saw that not all delinquent youth went through the same path in order to achieve illegitimate success. There are three kinds of gang subcultures that could develop: crime oriented, conflict oriented, retreatist, or drug oriented. Walter Miller disagreed with all three. Gangs are a reactive subculture whose delinquent behavior is compensation for a lower class failure to reach middle class goals. He concluded that lower class is characterized by six focal concerns: trouble, toughness, excitement, fate, smartness, and autonomy.